Welcome to the OK2A News Hour. My name is Bruce Delay. I'm here with Tim Gillespie, President and co-founder of the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association. Welcome, Tim.
Glad to be here.
Tim, how would you describe OK2A, and what are your primary goals for this organization?
OK2A was founded in 2009. A friend of mine and I actually had started at his kitchen table over coffee one morning talking about it, that there was just a lack of any consistent lobbying activity for gun rights, and especially the more constitutional side of things like open carry and so forth. There were those that were lobbying for hunting bills and stuff like that, but not really pushing for open carry, and that was one of the things that we wanted to see adopted in Oklahoma. And so that got the ball rolling, and before long we met with Larry Pratt with Gun Owners of America, and he was very helpful in helping us get things started. Our first session was 2010, and we did actually have one bill that year that we got through, but then after that it just continued to build and build. Helped get open carry passed in 2012. We also helped with passage of the Emergency Powers Act that gives that protects your Second Amendment rights during a declared state of emergency, and actually gives you the ability to sue not just the government in general, but the government officials that might be responsible for infringing on those rights during that declared state of emergency. So there's been several, the parking lot bill for the K through 12 schools, just several different things that we have done, about 40 measures, not bills, but sometimes more than one thing in a bill, but 40 different pro-gun measures that we have helped get through the process, get signed into law over the last 5 or 6 years.
So by now the organization has grown, the organization is more familiar with how things work at the Capitol, and they know your name. I mean, those legislators know who OK2A is. And so now, currently, we're about halfway through this year's legislative session. Can you characterize for us where are the bills that relate to gun rights? Currently, I know some haven't made it this far, and some have. Where are we right now at the Capitol with OK2A?
We are at that halfway point. Everything from the House is over in the Senate, and everything from the Senate's over in the House. That's still moving. For a little while there, it looked like it was going to be a pretty lean year. There were fewer bills still moving at this point than there have been in some of the past years. But we do still have about 7 or 8 bills that are going through the process. Some of those are important bills. Some of those are one of those in particular we're going to be making some amendments to that's going to make it an even bigger bill. For example, we had three bills come from the House that are over in the Senate now. House Bill 1460 adds knives to the state preemption laws dealing with firearms. You know, it makes sense to do that because you don't want a scenario where one town allows open carry because it's state law, but then another town says no open carry here. You're not going to know that unless you're familiar with the law. So the state, saw the need to go ahead and say, the laws that we make concerning guns apply everywhere in the state, and they trump any local law. And so forth.
And that's important because you do have some left-leaning municipalities in the state of Oklahoma, and so it's important for OK2A to be working on these things.
Exactly, and one of the things that they do not include in that, though, is knives. Okay. And it's, which Oklahoma does have some pretty restrictive knife laws and kind of dumb knife laws, to be honest with you. But if you've got a situation like, for example, in Antlers, Oklahoma, they had a situation that their city council identified and dealt with on their own. I believe it was last year or the year before. You could open carry a 45 down Main Street, but if you got caught with a pocket knife, you were going to get a ticket. So it just makes no sense. And so we are trying to add that to the preemption on the gun laws, add knives to that. The bill actually passed last year, but it was one of the 3 Second Amendment bills that got caught up in the governor's temper tantrum that she threw when she vetoed those 12 bills. And I will say that OK2A was primarily responsible for the very swift and well, the very swift action that the House took, because we really got after her right as she did that. The NRA was a little bit more responsible for the push in the Senate. But anyway, she I think regrets those vetoes, and two of the bills of the three Second Amendment bills were then sent back through in other formats, other bills. But that one wasn't, and so we were introduced it this year, and it's moving through the process. Then there's House Bill 1911, which that ought to be a gun bill. But
yeah, it's a good number.
Unfortunately, it's not a gun bill; it's a knife bill. It removes switchblades from the list of prohibited weapons in the state law. We had a few years ago did a bill to remove the spring-assisted knives. And got that through, and this is just the next step, because there are a lot of things that are mentioned in there that really, I mean, what difference does it make how you deploy the blade? You know, a knife's a knife. If you can carry a knife, you can carry a knife. And not to mention, if you can carry a 45, what are you worried about a switchblade about, you know? So,
you know, really these kind of concepts seem minor, but they address a concept that is extremely important, and that is either archaic laws that can be brought to bear that people don't even know exist, or newer laws that they have passed. People on the left, you might say, or anti-Second Amendment folks have passed, and they haven't used them yet, but they're waiting for the time to spring those laws on.
Right.
And we're learning now that this is a strategy that's being used across the country as well as federally, and so we want to head those things off, and that's kind of some of what you're talking about.
yes, some of it falls into the latter category, but this one is actually one. You know, a lot of these things were put in place all the way back to statehood, and we'll talk about the Constitution in just a minute. When you have a block of laws in a state constitution that were written by progressives, because Oklahoma joined the Union at that time where the progressive movement was picking up steam, and you know, it makes for some really just wrong-headed ideas that make it into law that you have to then deal with. So.
Well, what else we got? We have anything else going on right now at the Capitol?
There is one other House Bill 2014. It's not what we would really like, but it's a step in the right direction as far as making our schools safer. It gives each school district the ability to set policy allowing for staff members to be trained as reserve school resource officers. So then that you can have some teachers and so forth able to carry concealed on the school grounds. And there is training. It's about a week-long training regimen that they have to go through, which is better than what they were wanting to do a couple years ago. It would have almost been initially they were talking about basically sending them through reserve police officer training. Wow. You know, you don't even know how to do field sobriety tests.
True.
So,
I don't know. Middle school's kind of rough these days.
Yeah. But anyway, so that's the third House bill that's over in the Senate. In the House, we've got several good Senate bills. Senate Bill 41 deals with knife preemption, or I'm sorry, knife preemption. We already talked about that. It deals with the definition of a pistol in the Self-Defense Act. Self-Defense Act is our state's handgun licensing law. If you're carrying a judge or something like that where you've got 410 shot shells in it, technically you're not within the law. So this fixes that. Senate Bill 56 removes the requirement for a person to put their Social Security number on the handgun license application, which is actually against federal law for them to require that. But the OSBI has actually fought having that requirement removed.
You're watching the OK2A News Hour with Tim Gillespie, president and co-founder of OK2A. My name is Bruce Delay. We're going to come back after a brief break, and one of the things we're going to talk about is this constitutional amendment to the state constitution that OK2A is proposing to strengthen our Second Amendment rights in Oklahoma. Representative Richard Morissette questioning Representative Dan Fisher at the Oklahoma legislature on the constitutional amendment to strengthen the Second Amendment in Oklahoma.
This handout that I got on my desk, OK2A, OK2A.org, I'm going to presume that that is the impetus for this energy and effort to amend the Constitution. Is that a fair statement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I would suggest, sir, and I hope you would take my suggestion, that if this is not the impetus of your efforts today, that you would not place these things on our desks, because if it's not your point, don't put it there. In your language, whoever wrote this, and I assume it was the people at Y2K or whatever they are,
Representative Richard Morissette doesn't seem to like the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association. Maybe it's because he doesn't like the Second Amendment. Join the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association to protect your Second Amendment rights from liberal politicians like Representative Richard Morissette. For more information on the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association, go to the internet at www.ok2a.org. Welcome back to the OK2A News Hour. This is Bruce Delay. We're talking with Tim Gillespie, President and co-founder of OK2A here in the great state of Oklahoma. Tim, we're going to talk about a constitutional amendment that you are working on, but first let's wrap up some of the bills that are going through this current legislative session in Oklahoma City. For instance, SB 56 and SB 64. Yeah. Enlighten us.
Well, SB 56, like I said, that is the one that deals with the Social Security number. And as I said, OSBI has fought that in the past, and I have a feeling that they will fight it again this year. And I don't understand why our state's top investigative organization has a problem with complying with federal law. But apparently that's been an issue. And we've seen that earlier this year with another bill. They were lobbying very heavily against, and it frustrates me when you have people on the government's payroll, on the people's payroll, that are at the Capitol lobbying against the people's rights, while the people are too busy to be there because they're at work earning that government official's salary. But yet that's been an issue with OSBI and higher ed as well with some of these bills. But Senate Bill 56 just simply brings our state into compliance with federal law when it comes to the use of the Social Security numbers. And so hopefully OSBI won't fight us on that like they have in the past.
Well, I know they have a different director. I think the past director would not necessarily have fought it like this. The new director has other, I believe, loyalties and alliances that the original one did not. So that may be what you're working against.
Yeah. And the other bill, Senate Bill 164, deals with the preclusions in the handgun licensing law. Under current law, if you have a misdemeanor drug conviction, and again, we're talking about misdemeanors. We're not talking about the drug traffickers. We're not talking about the dealers that are out there on the corner selling to kids. We're talking about people that have had a misdemeanor drug conviction sometime in their past. They can never obtain a handgun license in Oklahoma under our current law.
It's almost like somebody has an agenda to keep people from getting guns, and they're looking for any reason to keep them from doing that.
And we've seen a couple different instances. One guy, they dug up something from out of state from 30 years ago, and have precluded him because of that. We know of one individual that about 15 years ago had a misdemeanor drug conviction, got caught with a joint basically, has not had any brushes with the law since, is a deacon in this church now, doesn't mess with that stuff anymore, but yet under our current state law, he can never have a handgun license. And so Senate Bill 164 would limit that preclusion to 10 years. Inside of 10 years, you would still not be able to get one, but once you get past that 10-year mark and you've not had any other issues, you've paid your debt basically, and you can you can get a handgun permit at that point.
What, now, some of these things you can kind of tell if they're going to have a harder time to getting through, and others, let's say on this particular 164, what do you think the chances are of that bill making it?
It seems like it's moving the shit. But one of the things that's kind of funny about how it works, you have to run sometimes these bills for 2, 3, 4 years, and you'll have a situation where nobody wants to touch it, and it just doesn't go anywhere. Then all of a sudden, the next year you run it again, thinking it's not going to go anywhere again this year, and it'll sell through the process with ease. A lot of times it's kind of like with open carry. It didn't pass on the first time. There had to be a discussion, and people had to start to get used to that idea. And as much Chicken Little warnings as we had, blood will run the streets, skies falling, every traffic accident will turn into a gunfight. That was one of them that was made about concealed carry, back in the 90s. And then you find out after a very short time, well, these problems that the progressives threw out at us that were going to be an issue didn't happen. And sometimes I'd like to look at them and say, I told you so. We told you that in all the other states where they do this, these problems haven't come to fruition. So, but unfortunately, that's just the nature of humanity, and sometimes you got to get people used to the idea. And so we've run that particular bill for several years, and this year Senator Stanislawski is the one that's running it. And I think we stand a pretty good chance of getting that through this year.
One of the other aspects of OK2A is it's an educational organization. They look, you guys really look to educate, and let's face it, the lawmakers need a lot of education. You would think they'd be up on these things, but they're not. And if you don't have time, or they don't have anyone to tell them the truth about these issues, they'll just be making wrong decisions. And so we all appreciate OK2A for the education aspect. Now let's jump and shift gears here to this constitutional amendment. OK2A members desire to amend the Oklahoma State Constitution in order to strengthen our gun rights in the state. You would think that the Oklahoma Constitution is pretty strong in the area of gun rights, but there is kind of an anchor piece over the last year or so that has developed called HJR 1009. It's a measure to get an amendment on the statewide ballot to amend the Constitution at the state level. Tell us about this important piece of it's not really legislation exactly. It's not a bill to become a law.
It's a referendum.
A referendum to amend our state constitution.
Right. Basically, the problem, it starts with the wording of our state constitution. It talks about you have the right to protect your person and property and so forth. And then there's a semicolon and it says, but nothing herein contained shall prevent the legislature from regulating the carrying of weapons. And so you have this situation where the Constitution says you have this right, but we're going to regulate this right, which to me means it's not a right. If it's a right, you can't regulate it. That makes it a privilege.
It certainly doesn't sound as strong as the Second Amendment in the United States Constitution.
No, it's definitely not, and that goes back to what I said about Oklahoma coming into the Union at that point in time when the progressive movement was gaining steam, and that state Second Amendment, which is Article 2, Section 26 of our state Constitution, that is proof positive of what I'm talking about there. That is obviously written by progressives, and then you have that as your foundation, and then from there you add in some bad case law. There's been 3 cases in particular that have gone through our state court system. In 1908, Ex parte Thomas, Mr. Thomas was caught carrying a concealed handgun. He was convicted. They appealed his conviction all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And the court looked at the Constitution and just absolutely butchered it. They said that there is no individual right there, and there clearly is, because it says the right of the citizen to keep and bear arms in defense of his personal property, so like I said, and so forth. It's very clearly an individual right, but they said there is no individual right. It has to do only with the militia. And so because it's a militia right, handguns aren't effective militia weapons, they said. And so therefore handguns are not protected under the Second Amendment, or under the Article 2, Section 26.
That sounds just like the progressive mantra they keep repeating on television today.
Yeah.
That, hey, that only applies to the military or the militia and so forth. And if a handgun is not an effective weapon for the militia, why do they issue 45s in the Marine Corps and so forth?
Well, that's why I've always said, you tell that to a combat medic, that all he's got's a 1911, you know, or a M9 or whatever they carry now. But
so this is a very key sticking point that OK2A is not going to let go of. You're going to keep on working this until, you know, if you have to go to the next year or the next year, because it's so important. Now, we're going to have to take another break and come back and finish on this. But I really want our audience to grasp the importance, because it's being brushed off by some people. Oh, it's not needed. We don't need to strengthen this. And the fact is, there are those who would like to use any of these loopholes to take away our gun rights in Oklahoma.
I'm Tim Gillespie, president and co-founder of the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association. Can't emphasize enough how important it is that we have numbers behind us when we go to the state capitol to lobby for Second Amendment rights. Either myself or our Vice President, Don Spencer, are there pretty much every day. But when we go and we can tell them that we've got this membership behind us, this organization of people, it really makes a difference. Phone calls and emails make a difference. We need people to be engaged on the issue. Get engaged today by going to OK2A.org and joining our email list and joining the organization. You can join OK2A for as little as $25 a year, but join today at OK2A.org. Thank you.
Welcome back to the OK2A News Hour. We're talking with Tim Gillespie, president, co-founder of OK2A. Tim, you were just talking about the progressive left and how it's at the beginning of statehood at Oklahoma, they played a role. And then now, as we know, this is a ideology that is permeating our cultures nationwide. Just as an example of the type of legislator we have to deal with, let's take a quick look at Richard Morissette down at the Oklahoma State Capitol. On the other side of these issues than our champions, for example, Dan Fisher at the Capitol.
Representative, would you agree with me that House District 60, your district, has many problems and needs that this legislature could address on everyday people? And you are aware that the deadline for passing bills out of this House is tomorrow at midnight. Do you feel that this type of legislation warrants the type of scrutiny that we are now having the day before the deadline?
Now, Tim, there's a good example of what we're dealing with and what you were just describing, and why OK2A needs to exist to make sure and protect the gun rights of our citizens.
Well, and I will tell you, I actually like Richard Morissette. I think he's funny, but unfortunately not on this issue. Because you're dealing with one of the core, fundamental issues that makes a society free, and all of the other rights that we have depend on this right. It's the linchpin, and if you pull it, everything else just falls apart. And so, and you see that as you look at this the case law that I'm talking about. The next case that we would want to mention was a case from 1929 when deputies went to serve a search warrant. There was this gentleman, Mr. Pierce, was a bootlegger. Everybody knew he was a bootlegger, probably. I'm sure that it was well known. And they went to go find his still. When they served the warrant, they ordered him out of his house So he complied with them. He went out in the front yard. They went in, they searched, they couldn't find the still. But like I say, because I'm sure everybody knew that, you know, he was a bootlegger and everything, they were going to take him in for something. So when they couldn't find the still and they came out of the house and there he stood out in his front yard, he had a Colt revolver in his belt. And so they arrested him for carrying an unconcealed handgun on his own property. And again, he was convicted. They appealed it. It went up to the Court of Criminal Appeals. The Court of Criminal Appeals then said, well, because the Supreme Court has said that the handguns aren't protected, and because you have in the Constitution it says the state has the legislature has the right to regulate the carrying of weapons, then there's no limit put on that. Then in fact that means that they can regulate whether or not you can carry in your own front yard. And this was actually the case. A lot of people don't realize this, but it was actually illegal for you to carry an unconcealed handgun on your own property outside of your home for the purposes of self-defense up until 2012. We put that into the open carry bill. Wow. It was still illegal. So these, you know, you can say, well, that was 1908 and 1929, but the fact of the matter is this stuff is still looked at and still considered the law of the land. And in 1998, the state Supreme Court had a case in which a gentleman had a application for a handgun license denied, so he sued OSBI. And in the course of that, those hearings, the state Supreme Court went back and cited Thomas and Pierce, basically reaffirming them as law of the land. Wow. The gentleman won the suit in '98, but the court actually more or less said that you have no right under the state constitution in Oklahoma. They actually said that the legislature could ban the possession of and ownership of handguns in Oklahoma today if they wanted to. And so what that means is essentially you have no more rights when it comes to the keeping and bearing of arms than the legislature this year decides you should have.
Wow. And if the Supreme Court in our state has already demonstrated that they'll go back and use old case law to reaffirm their ideology, which is anti-gun, then we know we have to get a constitutional amendment passed in our state to strengthen our gun rights, because it makes it much more difficult for a Supreme Court to get around a Second Amendment style gun right law in our own state constitution if it's been shored up by OK2A.
Well, and some of the things that we are working to do through this, there's a lot of background with it. I mean, we actually filed the bill the first time during the last legislature, the last 2-year cycle. Almost got it. One senator basically killed it, Senator Don Barrington. Higher Ed came out against it, but we had a workaround there where we had Higher Ed beat as far as that goes. But we had one senator that's always kind of one of the hang-ups, and we just needed to go let him look at the language that we were going to amend into it to deal with the Higher Ed situation. And if he was okay with it, everybody else had said, if he's okay with it, we're okay with it. And when I went to talk to him, he said, no more gun bills. I'm not signing out any more gun bills. He'd gotten some nasty phone calls from some people up in Tulsa, and he wasn't going to do any more gun bills. He actually told me, you need to control your people. You know, and I
understand. Is he still there?
Yes, he's still there.
Okay.
He is the chairman of the Senate Public Safety Committee, Senator Don Barrington. And so he was willing to hold the constitutional rights of the citizens of Oklahoma hostage because he got a couple of nasty phone calls from some people in Tulsa.
Well, they may have been from donors, or you never know who these key people are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're going to be that thin-skinned, you have no business being in the Senate, and you definitely have no business being a leader in the Senate. But he refused to sign it out, so we filed it this year. And it's something that we've worked on for several years with several different legal scholars. One of them is a professor in Oklahoma City that is one of the top experts on Second Amendment case law in the country, actually. You know, there's been a lot of work that's gone into this to shore it up and make sure that it does what it's intended to do. A couple of things, handguns are specifically mentioned in there. It's handguns, rifles, shotguns, you know, non-lethal weapons like mace and so forth, and then arms in common use. And so and knives are actually specifically mentioned. And so it covers everything. It spells it out so that you can't have this situation where, well, handguns aren't included in that. Yes, they are. It says handguns. It covers specifically covers the recreational use of them. It specifically covers the self-defense use of them, and it specifically covers the militia use of them. That's all in there. And then it actually goes on to say that any regulation of the right shall be subject to strict scrutiny. Now, what that means is there's three different levels of scrutiny that the courts use. There's rational basis, intermediate, and strict. Right. Most Second Amendment law is looked at under intermediate scrutiny right now, which basically says you have to have a compelling state interest. That's that term that you hear so often. Whereas strict scrutiny says you have to have that compelling state interest, but then the state also has to prove that there's no way that they could accomplish the goal that would be less intrusive into the rights of the people. An example, Kwong versus Bloomberg, a couple years ago, Mr. Kwong in New York City sued the city for over their handgun licensing. Mm-hmm. Under intermediate scrutiny, they said, well, you know, we want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. So there's this compelling state interest. Court said, okay, that's good enough for us. If they had been using strict scrutiny, then the next question would have at least been, okay, why are you charging $300 and some odd for this permit? Does it actually cost you that much to process and so forth? Right. And so that they would have lost on that under strict scrutiny. So you may not necessarily get to a point of constitutional carry, but you will get to a point where your gun laws will make a whole lot more sense if they're using strict scrutiny.
Well, it's definitely a compelling interest when you're talking about the ability of any single legislature simply doing away with gun rights if they feel like it, right, or if they feel like they ought to, or if you elect a left-leaning legislature next time, that's something that they literally could do to the citizens of Oklahoma. We can't have that. We really need to have this constitutional amendment. You're watching the OK2A News Hour. This is Bruce Delay and Tim Gillespie. My name is Bruce Delay. I pastor the Heartland Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. As a preacher, as a Bible preacher and teacher, I understand the importance of the Second Amendment here in the United States of America. And I understand also that the Second Amendment is what protects our First Amendment rights to assemble and our rights of free speech. Right now, they are being infringed almost daily. Weekly, you'll hear stories of new laws and new efforts to stop the preaching of the gospel in some ways, some of the things that the Bible refers to. And so I'm in the business of First Amendment free speech. Well, the Second Amendment is what protects my free speech. Therefore, I would encourage everybody. I encourage our people at our church. I encourage everyone I can to become a member of the OK2A organization. The fight for our Second Amendment rights in Oklahoma cannot be overstated, and it's OK2A that is on that fight down at the Capitol for us on a daily basis. For more information on the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association, go to the internet at www.ok2a.org. Welcome back to the OK2A News Hour. We're on the downhill slide of this particular segment. Tim Gillespie is with us, President, co-founder of OK2A. Tim, we were just talking about the need for a state amendment regarding gun rights because it provides a second layer of protection. Our national gun rights under the U.S. Constitution are under attack and assault constantly by those who would say, oh, the guns are only for the military, and militia doesn't mean militia, and the right to keep and bear doesn't really mean the right to keep and bear. And so the state constitution can provide a second level. Can you explain to us why that's so important, especially in light of the day we live in, where there are so many people trying to stop our gun rights?
Yes. You know, often I've had people say, well, what's the big deal? You do have the Second Amendment and so forth. And what I always tell them is that you have to remember that political winds can change fairly quickly. Colorado is a very good example of that. 20 years ago, if you had gone back in your trusty time machine and stood in front of a town hall meeting and talked about how, 20 years from now we might have to do recall elections because our state Senate's going to ram through magazine limit legislation and quote-unquote assault gun or assault weapons bans and things like that, they would have laughed you out of the room.
The point that manufacturers like Magpul would actually leave the state.
Exactly. But now 20 years later, we see how the state's political climate has changed, and they did these things, and as a result, you had all these recall elections, and yes, they were successful, but the fact of the matter is they still passed those laws. And what if the recall hadn't been successful? There's a lot of things there that come into play about you having the ability to deal with draconian gun control legislation from a bunch of progressives that are trying to take over a state or a country. And this amendment, if in place, would provide that second layer of protection, as you said, that would then give you the ability to go to a state court, because if you're going to go into federal court and try to overturn a state magazine capacity limit law, I don't know that you're going to get very far. The federal courts don't seem interested in overturning. I mean, we've had some victories in federal courts, but I'm not positive that that's going to work out for you that well. But if you have this amendment on the books at the state level that requires strict scrutiny, you can go into the state courts and hopefully remedy that. Not to mention some of these other silly things that we've talked about. The switchblades, some of the issues dealing with the SDA licenses, like the cost of it. You might not get constitutional carry out of this amendment, but maybe you would get a reduced price for the license. You might get one of the bills that we've run for a couple of years dealt with non-secured public buildings, the state and local government buildings that have the gun buster signs on it, and you're going to get in a lot of trouble if you carry in there. But you can't tell me that the other person's not carrying, but you're going to tell me, Mr. Law-abiding citizen, you got to leave your gun in the car. And so, some of these kinds of things can be dealt with not just through the legislature, but through the courts then. Because the legislature, as we've already discussed, isn't often quick to move when it comes to even your constitutional rights. So it really is important. It gives us another avenue that we can use to try to protect our rights, not just the Second Amendment, but all of our rights.
Well, any battle is ebb and flow. And if you don't show up for a fight, you're definitely going to lose the fight. But OK2A is here for us in our state to show up. And OK2A will show up at the Capitol. They'll show up on a consistent basis and fight for these gun rights that, many of us don't have the time and the so forth to be there. But OK2A is there for us.
Right.
Now, we've been talking about HJR 1009, which is the measure to get a amendment to our state constitution on the ballot that will strengthen the language and strengthen our gun rights in Oklahoma. Let's shift gears a little bit now, Tim, and let's go to kind of an area that a lot of people may not know about OK2A. You actually are involved in some things that on the surface don't look like they are related to gun rights, and yet they are indirectly related, most likely. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're involved with on the level that seemingly is not gun rights to a lot of onlookers?
Well, there are two measures, and both of them are actually also constitutional amendment referendums. One that we have come out in favor of, one that we have come out in opposition to. HJR 1012 would be an amendment to our state constitution that would protect your right to farm and ranch. And of course, you know, just apart from the need to be able to produce the food necessary for to feed our population, there is some application of this, we believe, all the way down to the level of your backyard garden. And when we look at what the United Nations is doing with the Agenda 21 initiatives that they have, where they're trying to control land and control food supply and water supply and so forth, we just felt like it was important for any liberty-minded group to step up and come out in favor of that and help that, you know, make it through the process and get to the ballot. One that we've opposed is SJR 30, and this is very important. I really hope anybody that's watching this will take note of this and get engaged on this issue, because it could be very detrimental to our state. SJR 30 would limit the state legislature from being able to deal with anything other than budget bills on even-numbered years. What else happens on even-numbered years?
That sounds like a politician's bill.
Yes. One of the things that, and call me cynical, but I believe that there is absolutely no coincidence that they picked the even-numbered years as the one to say that you can't do this. Now, they will respond, well, we've put a safety valve in there. Yeah, but you've got to have a 3/4 majority of both chambers just to file a bill that deals with something other than the budget on even-numbered years, on election years. When we have sat there and seen how not only OK2A but other liberty-type groups have to, I mean, it's like beating your head against a brick wall trying to get liberty bills and constitutional bills through the Senate, especially on odd-numbered years when they don't have to worry about the ballot box. But somehow on even-numbered years they like gun bills. Go figure.
Right.
You know, so
Vote for me. I like guns.
yeah, and I the thing that just really I laughed about it when I saw it, but I did respond to him. Senator David Holt from Oklahoma City put a post on Facebook talking about how he was glad this passed and was just championing it, and talking about how he looked forward to the day when we would focus more on the budget and do less legislating. And so I responded to him. I said, isn't legislating the legislature's job? And he talked about how, yeah, but we're usually infringing on somebody's rights when we're legislating. And I almost had to put duct tape on my head, as Glenn Beck used to say, to keep it from exploding, because Senator Holt is the one the year before that single-handedly killed the non-secured buildings bill. And I reminded him of that we had a bill that would have removed an infringement that had been placed on the people, and that he single-handedly killed it.
Well, this highlights how important it is to get the right people in to the right places, because one guy can hose things up, one guy can be a thorn in the side of liberty-minded people like OK2A. Right now, just briefly, if you would tell us, there's a statewide position that is the chair of the GOP, the Republican Party. You guys, the OK2A has come out and you have endorsed a candidate. And tell us a little bit about who you endorsed and why in the time we have left.
We've endorsed Randy Brogdon for that position. We sent out questionnaires to all three of the candidates. Chairman Weston did not respond, but both the other two candidates did. And we just felt like Randy was the guy to do what needs to be done. We think three things, basically: educating the grassroots and engaging them on the platform, educating people as to the legislature's record in relation to the platform, and then getting the message out in the media. And we just felt like he was the best guy for the job.
Well, the former state senator from the city of Owasso, Randy Brogdon, you're endorsing for the next GOP statewide chair.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us on the OK2A News. This is Bruce Delay with Tim Gillespie. See you next time.